This is the World Today Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980.
This is Jimmy A. Dennis on death row at SCI Green. Please help me. Please help save my life.
Witnesses consistently describe the killer as between 5'10" and 6 feet, 185 to 200 pounds, dark-skinned black male. Jimmy is 5'4", a good 6 to 8 inches shorter than they described, much lighter skinned than witnesses described. In 1991, weighed between 125 to 130 pounds. And not to mention that early police reports mentioned other perpetrators, a getaway car, a gun was never found. There's many inconsistencies.
I think even when the truth finally comes out and I have my day of truth, which I firmly believe I will have, there's always going to be a sadness within my heart.
All right, some audio around the case of Jimmy Dennis. Last Wednesday, after 22 years on death row, Judge Anita Brody, this is in Pennsylvania, vacated both the conviction and the death sentence in a scathing indictment of the prosecutor's case. The judge called the conviction against Jimmy Dennis a grave miscarriage of justice based on scant evidence at best. She faulted the police for shoddy work, faulted the prosecutors as well. Tracy Lamourie is with me now, co-founder, director of the Canadian Coalition Against the Death Penalty and the Justice for Jimmy campaign. Tracy, hi, how are you?
Hi, good evening. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for coming on with us today. First of all, your reaction to the judge's ruling on Wednesday.
It was a deeply emotional moment, I have to say, for everybody on the team. It was we've been involved for 15 years. You mentioned he's been on death row for 22 years. We got involved back in 1998. We were able to visit him in 2002 on death row. And it's been a long, hard road with a lot of appeals being lost at the lower level state courts. So it was, very hard to believe and a deeply emotional moment, and truly, the culmination of a lot of our work and what Jimmy's been saying since day one, to see a 46-page extraordinary opinion by a judge that began and ended with the fact that he's wrongfully convicted was very heartening. 22
years in death row, as you say, your involvement 15 years. What twigged you to this case? What was special about this case?
Well, back in 1998, we were just local activists in Toronto. We worked on things like anti-racism work and that sort of issue. And in the early days of the internet, we were just sort of, looking online for things of interest. And somehow we'd come across a page that was essentially a pen pal request page, but that prisoners were paying to be listed on. And that's obviously something we'd never had any past interest or anything in, but it came up in some searches for anti-racism stuff. And there was this prisoner, unlike all the other ones, who was looking for pen pals or whatever they were looking for. He said, I don't want a pen pal. I want help. This is my only avenue to speak out to the world. And so we basically, for some reason, something called on us to write him. We wrote him. How innocent can this guy be? And he responded with reams of legal documentation. But even back in 1998, before we had the lawyers on the case who've done an extraordinary, amount of work in the last 13 years and uncovered so much more, it was, very obvious at that date that he was innocent. And basically our organization was founded with the thinking that if other people saw what we were seeing, they would be as disturbed as we were. And we were hoping to eventually find lawyers or someone who could afford to pay for a lawyer who would be able to uncover the truth in this case. So this is, again, really heartening after so many years when initially it was just Dave Parkinson and I who had, founded CCADP as a result of this Jimmy Dennis case, calling for media attention, calling for somebody to pay attention to this case. And then now a judge has finally, taken to heart everything that he's been saying since day one.
Dennis is now 42 years old. Now, this is a quote from Philadelphia District Attorney Seth Williams. He said his office was disappointed. The judge accepted what he called the defense's slanted factual allegations. He said he's reviewing the state's options. Here's what he says about the case. The defendant was convicted for the brutal murder of a teenage girl on her way home from school in broad daylight. 3 passersby saw him do it and identified him in court without any possible motive to lie. I don't know much more about the case than what I've read here and a few other media pieces, but killing a teenage girl in broad daylight, how could they possibly have got the wrong guy?
Well, you'd think so. Absolutely. It was a case at the time that, really created a lot of anger. As you can imagine, in the city, broad daylight, some girls coming home from school and being killed, in front of what would it be? You'd imagine it'd be all kinds of witnesses could be around at 4:30 in the afternoon on a weekday. But basically, the judge called the conviction against Dennis a quote grave miscarriage of justice based on quote scant evidence at best. And she found, and I welcome everybody to please read over the 46 pages where she details every single thing that they used to convict him and rips it apart, as though she was the defense, which you just do not see. It's an extraordinary decision. And so she basically found in many cases all over the trial that they withheld evidence at the initial trial and that the whole case was based on very shoddy police and prosecutorial work. So basically, as it stands right now, it's not uncommon for a DA to, stand up and stick to their guns. He's still deciding. That's really common, whether he's going to be willing to take the medicine, as we're saying, and give up on their case or deciding what to do. Essentially, they have 30 days to appeal this judge's decision, 6 months to decide whether to retry, which would be ridiculous because they literally have no evidence left. Their case has been ripped to shreds. They've hidden all kinds of evidence that we've been trying to get for years. They've said it was lost and everything else. So now they have nothing to retry him on. So we're hoping after 6 months, if they don't do that, then they would open the doors of death row. Jimmy will finally be free. At this moment, he remains on death row. And so obviously we at the CKNW and the International Justice for Jimmy campaign are encouraging everyone to help us in the fight. And I don't know if you're interested in that. We spoke with Jimmy by phone last night from death row. And he wanted to thank everybody who's ever written a letter or signed a petition, shared it on their social media. He wants everyone to know that's what has kept him going and kept giving him hope all these years. But we want to really encourage people to keep on doing that because it could still be several months before he's released. He is going to be released. I mean, this is the end of this is the beginning of the end of his long fight for justice. Essentially, he's going to be out. It's just a matter of how and when the prosecutor's office is going to deal with it. So.
I just want to jump in because did part of the decision to overturn this rest on the eyewitness testimony? I mean, we've heard a lot of growing sort of second guessing about the value of eyewitness identification and particularly the use of police lineups and photo arrays and that kind of thing.
Exactly. The entire case, that's all. I mean, it was a completely eyewitness testimony case. And then, some people think that's a strong case. But when you look into it and you see police manipulations and everything else, it just falls apart. And as I said, even the information that he sent us initially back in 1998 basically in 2000, a team of lawyers from Arnold and Porter out of Washington was looking for a strong case of factual innocence. And that is a miracle in itself that in 2000 we were able to get this team as of 5 years into the case, if there would have been billable hours, it would have been $3 million. They put 5 lawyers on the case.
Wow.
That does not happen. This is because it was a strong factual innocence. They took it on pro bono. They've had this their whole, careers. And, so we have, it's just it's just very scary because there's so many people that are sitting on death row as long as Jimmy have, who've never had that happen as well. So people have to realize, the problems in the system are just endemic. It's not just the Jimmy Dennis case. His case was, an extraordinary one, but it's not an easy one because it wasn't a DNA case. So it's taken us a long time for the truth to come out, but he's always said the truth will come out, and, we're happy that this is the beginning of it happening.
And he said he was on a bus somewhere else, right? He wasn't even there at the time.
Absolutely, and that was one of the things that they had, the prosecution had hidden in the police at the time of trial was, if you're familiar with military time, that's 13 o'clock. I won't get into too much of the details of the case, but basically, somebody was confused about military time, and the police and nobody else stopped it at the time of the trial, which made a difference of 3 hours where Jimmy was, so therefore his alibi. Wow. Yeah, exactly, and that's one of many things that we knew in 1998 before everything else had come out, which is just. Again, and I want to really encourage people to go to jimmydennis.org. There's nothing hidden there. There's an address where people want to write to him directly. There's reams of legal documentation on there. There's this recent 46-page decision is public knowledge, and that's on jimmydennis.org and jimmydennis.com. And, so he's always begged and pleaded for people to please look at this case. and now we finally, after all these years and courts just rubber stamping it at the lower level, which, he always said we'd get success at the federal level where they actually are going to look at what happened.
Is that what this was? I'm sorry, is this a federal court judge, Anita Brody?
It's a
okay.
Federal court judge.
And clearly she's convinced, and so we've got this guy who spent 22 years on death row. 22 years awaiting execution, possible execution for a crime he didn't convict and he didn't commit. And to your larger point, Tracy, how many other Jimmy Dennises are out there?
Exactly. Actually, he's not the first person that after we made the page for Jimmy Dennis in 1998, we began CKNW.org, Canadian Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which was somewhat controversial to some people, but we ended up offering anybody sentenced to death anywhere in the world. They don't have any internet access or anything, but they could write to us and we'd put their information, their case information, their legal documentation, their writing or their artwork, if that's all they had, online to make their case that this person shouldn't be executed, whether it was a legal case or just, more of an emotional case. But and since then, there was a prisoner that we had written originally in 1999 called Juan Roberto Melendez from death row in Florida. And he wrote, my name is Juan Melendez. They call me Puerto Rican Johnny. I've been here for 18 years and I'm innocent of this crime. And he was released from death row, I believe it was 2001. And he's been up in here to Toronto to speak and in Montreal to speak. And he goes all around the world and speaks about his wrongful conviction and release from death row and life on death row now, as Jimmy Dennis intends to do. So, yeah, Jimmy's not the first person that we've had on our page that I expect to be found innocent, and he won't be the last, I'm sure.
Tracy,
he's the reason we started.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to take a quick break here, and I want to open up this up to the listeners as well, because clearly with your group, Canadian Coalition Against the Death Penalty, you make very clear where you stand. I want to put the question to you when we come back. Is the death penalty ever justified, especially in really clear-cut cases, if there is such a thing? And I'd love to hear from our listeners as well at 604-280-9898, star 9898 on your cell phone, and long-distance toll-free 1-877-399-9898. We'll be back on CKNW News Talk 980.
At home or at work, listen online at cknw.com. This is the World Today Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. Once again, here's Sean Leslie.
All right, welcome back. Speaking with Tracy Lamourie, co-founder and director of the Canadian Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and with the Justice for Jimmy campaign, talking about the latest incident, and there have been many, of a guy on death row whose conviction is overturned. Judge says terrible work by the cops, by the DAs in the case, and Jimmy Dennis hopefully will be a free man not too long from now. Before I get to some calls here at 604-280-9898, star 9898 on your cell phone, Tracy, I wanted to ask you this, and again, as I said before the break, pretty clear where you stand. We have these, my buddies and I have these discussions in bar rooms every now and then, say, would you ever support the death penalty? And many of us come down and say, no, we don't support the death penalty, except in the really bad cases, and the Paul Bernardos of the world, and the Clifford Olsons of the world, right? Where, the guilt is beyond doubt, and the evilness, the vileness of what they've done is so shocking that you just want to string them up, I mean, what do you say to people like that? People like me, I guess.
Well, no, we've all, obviously, and people like me, we've all heard of terrible crimes that make us all angry. Obviously, when you hear horrible, inhuman things that some people can visit on each other, that's, going to make, especially compassionate people who engage in human rights work, obviously that would make people like us angry. But, you mentioned, there's a danger, number one, when we get heated up, though, and then we don't necessarily see clearly. Like, for example, the Jimmy Dennis case, you mentioned, that was a very high-profile case at the time. A teenage girl was shot on her way home from school.
For a pair of gold earrings, apparently, yeah.
So it's easy for the prosecutor to, we weren't there. Even in cases of DNA, for example, when you say, well, if there's DNA, it's proven. Well, you know what, I personally don't know how to read DNA. I don't know if you do, but I can name 5 or 6 cases where DNA readers are now in jail for, putting hundreds of people in jail.
Yes.
Wrongfully convicted when they worked too closely with police. But even beyond that, you mentioned the Bernardo case, and I actually think that's a pretty good illustration, which might surprise you, of why we shouldn't have the death penalty. Because here in the Bernardo case, we have 2 co-defendants who are equally guilty, and, people argue about that, but, they're basically equally guilty. One turns essentially state's evidence and gets released, and the other one gets executed. So now we've got one, which, again, very common in the death penalty, because they need to get their conviction. So now we have one person on death row. We got Paul Bernardo on death row. And we got Carla, after a couple of years, walking free the way she did. So 2 equally guilty, one's executed, one's not. Meanwhile, in 1992, Robert Baltovich was convicted of the murder of his girlfriend. He spent 8 years in prison before he was released in 2000, right? And since then, circumstantial evidence has come out since his conviction and his release. He's been a free man for years and years, since 2000. But the reason they didn't retry him, because personal information came out since then. Again, it was circumstantial, but evidence has come out since his conviction that points to Paul Bernardo as the probable murderer of his girlfriend in 1992. So now again, now we have this great case, the Bernardo case, that's the shining example of why we should have a death penalty in Canada. And we have two equally guilty prisoners. One gets death row, great. One walks. And meanwhile, we have an innocent guy either executed or at risk of execution for the serial killer's crime.
Wow.
So it's a pretty good illustration.
Good point. Let's get some calls. 604-280-9898. Do you think the death penalty is ever justified? Rich in Vancouver. Thanks for waiting, Rich. Go ahead.
Hi, Sean. I just wanted to say shoddy police work and shoddy DA work also leads to injustice for that little girl because her killer's been free and under the radar for 22 years.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's a great point, Rich and right. Tracy. I mean, exactly. So for over 2 decades, everyone's thought they had the guy. They didn't have the guy.
And even worse is, police had undeveloped leads pointing to what we're pretty sure was the guy who's actually died since then, but he was free, for years and years. But anyway, that's, nobody's been tried or convicted other than Jimmy Dennis, so we can't say that. But after 22 years, there's a lot of... It was shoddy police work. Let's just leave it at that. And it's, there's no way, there's nothing they could say to defend the work that they did in that case.
Do you sense any change in the United, and of course the death penalty is applied on a state-by-state basis, right? And we all know Texas is the gung-ho killer of prisoners. In fact, they've actually run out of the drug, is the last I saw, that they use to put people to death and have to reorder. But is there any sense in your mind that some of those states with death penalty are starting to rethink it, given all the findings that mostly driven by DNA, as you've outlined, Tracy, but also in this case of incompetence?
Yeah, in the States, we're still locked in this thing where they think that tough on crime means, from a political level that you have to be pro-death penalty. But that's beginning to change slowly over the 10 or 15 years that we've been doing this. And basically, it's coming from the wrongful convictions, like you said. If Jimmy, when Jimmy's released, I don't know if he was released this week, I think he'd be the 143rd person released from death row, in recent times. And if it'll be the 144th. There's another case out of Arizona, Deborah Milkey, which has been being fought for an equal amount of time. So when people are talking all the time about speeding up appeals and everything, in one way I agree, because it should never have taken 22 years for a judge to actually look at this clear case, and clear case of innocence, and point out that there's something wrong here. But in another way, it's terrifying when you think of all the people that don't have proper legal help. If you're right now, if somebody wants to put you on trial for your life in a state, you better hope you have $100,000 right now to get a lawyer. If you don't, you got big problems. Because
as you said, in this case, it was a law firm that finally came forward, and they did it pro bono, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. And initially, his family, he didn't even have a public defender. His family, with their little bit of working money, they paid for him to have a lawyer who only went and visited him twice and do any investigation on the case. And
wow.
And he's also been basically a scathing indictment of his work as well in this judge's decision. So a lot of things conspired to put him where he is. But yeah, it's terrifying when people say we should just take him out. We should cut down their appeals, because then that's we're going to take them outside the courthouse and just shoot them in the back of the courthouse. We just can't do that.
Well, maybe in Texas and Arizona they'd want to go there. Let's go back to the phone lines. Ellen in Nanaimo. Hi, Ellen. Go ahead.
Yes, a question I wanted to ask you guys. This is an interesting program here. Is there any precedent of people then suing the bloomin' judge / lawyers that actually made all the mistakes?
Good question, Ellen. And what about that, Tracy? I mean, what is a recourse here if you lost half your life in prison for something you didn't do?
Yeah. Well, there have been some recent cases in Pennsylvania where they've ended up suing. I'm not sure how many years it ended up taking, and they ended up getting between $5 million. I think Jimmy said one was $9 million. But, which would be great. But I know people say this a long time, but I have been on this case since 1998. I remember speaking to Jimmy Dennis when his daughters were like 6 years old, 9 years old, and his dream was to get out and have them playing on the lawn in front of him. And now both those young, daughters are like young women, they're 22, 25 or something. They both got young kids of their own. I remember all those years.
He's missed them. He's missed their entire lives.
Yeah. You can give him $5 million now. That's great. He'll be fed up. He'll get a house. We won't have to struggle and worry about how he'll be placed, because that's our next plan, is how to get him settled for life on the outside after 22 years on the inside. It's a whole new world now. And plus, he's been in a box the size of your bathroom for 23 hours a day with no human contact. So
yeah.
It's going to be, but he's in great spirits. He's in a great mental state. He's had a great team, a support team that we talk to him all the time. So we're confident with that, but it's going to be, it's a long road, and they should give him every penny that they can. But that's probably part of the reason they would fight. They want to fight freeing him because they don't want to admit their mistake, because then they're going to be up for, money.
Boy, oh boy. And again, you've outlined and I'll let you go in just a second here, Tracy, but you've outlined, the circumstances that came together in the Jimmy Dennis case, and even with the work of your group and other groups and the law firm during pro bono, it took 22 years. I think it's safe to say innocent people have been put to death in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can think of several off the top of my head that I would be pretty sure were innocent that were put to death.
It's unbelievable. Tracy, great to talk to you. We'll have to have you back on the show. It's been great to talk to you, and really appreciate you.
I hope to have Jimmy Dennis on the show. I hope to have
We'd
Jimmy
love
Dennis
to.
free, and then, we can have him on the show soon. So.
We'd love to do that. Tracy, great to talk to you. We'll let you go. Thank you.
Okay, JimmyDennis.org. Don't forget.
JimmyDennis.org. Tracy Lamourie, she's co-founder, director of the Canadian Coalition Against the Death Penalty and the Justice for Jimmy campaign. And really appreciate her time. Fascinating and disturbing story when you think about the number of people on death row in the United States and around the world, of course. And I know bad people are put to death. Guys who've done horrible things and women who've done horrible things, of course, but you do have to worry, I think, about the innocent people, the people who are there for no fault of their own, but because of prosecutorial and police misconduct and incompetence. It happens. That, I think, is the greatest warning against the death penalty. And I know I see the polls all the time that say a lot of Canadians want to reopen this. Canadians want to get the death penalty back. Well, and I some of that I feel myself when I think of the Paul Bernardos of the world and a few other cases. But I think Tracy laid out a pretty good case why we shouldn't go down that road here in Canada. But hey, if you couldn't get through, send me an email, sleslie@cknw.com. Coming up on the 5 o'clock news, and this is lovely.